A comment I've seen on most of my videos talking about the class balance in D&D often brings up a seeming issue with the different styles of design that goes into martial classes versus magical classes. What they're typically referring to is the idea that, like, when a magical class gets to level 20, for example, they can do insane things like warp the very earth to their will, summon huge tsunamis that can wipe out an army, or even stop time itself. And when a martial class gets to level 20, they can do things like stab 4 people in a single turn, or they can be like a little bit stronger than previously thought possible. Like, when you look at a high level martial class, it feels like they are being designed in a much more grounded fantasy setting. Sure, they can still pull off some feats of prowess, like 24 strength on a barbarian is certainly nothing to scoff at within the world of Faerun, and they are improving this at least somewhat in the 5.5 update later this year, where you can have fighters do somewhat impressive things like attack somebody 4 times and knock them back 40 feet in a turn. And that's a pretty impressive visual, like how you can just smack someone and they go flying across the map. But then you glance back over at the wizard who just turned into a dragon, built an entire castle, and then dropped a bunch of meteors from space onto their enemies all in a single afternoon. And, like, I've been thinking about this for a little bit, and, like, why would they have such dramatically different design philosophies for the different classes within the same game? Surely someone would notice that they're giving a lot more toys to these magical classes than the martial ones. But as I thought about it more, I came to the thought that what we're looking at is really more of a symptom of the actual underlying issue with the game, which I think is the spell slot system. I mean, after all, it can't just be a problem with a single designer, or even the entire current design team, because this is an issue that has permeated the game for decades. I mean, hell, this issue even exists in other similar games that aren't D&D, like Pathfinder to some degree. So after looking for a common underlying problem, I came to the conclusion that this design philosophy pretty naturally results from the nature of spell slots themselves and how they're used in games like D&D. So, for those of you that might need a refresher for whatever reason, spell slots are a pretty straightforward system. Every spellcaster has a limited number of slots that are further delineated into levels. So, for example, a 5th level wizard has 4 first level spell slots, 3 second level spell slots, and 2 third level spell slots. So you can cast Fireball using a 3rd level spell slot twice that day, and then after that point, you just can't cast any more 3rd level spells, and you have to cast weaker spells for the rest of the day until you can take a long rest to recover your spell slots. And to give the system some credit, I think I understand at least one of the main reasons why they designed the magic to work this way. If, for example, you instead used a simple mana bar like you would see in most video games, where each spell merely costs different amounts of mana, then you run into a big issue where it becomes difficult to balance out how many spells of each level that someone should be able to cast. For example, the same level 5 wizard using the official spell point system would have 27 spell points, or mana effectively, to spend on their spells for that day. And with the way that the costs are split between 1st, 2nd, and 3rd level spells, they could technically still cast the same number of each level of spell as they could normally. But they could also do very silly things like just cast Fireball 5 times instead of being limited to only being able to do it twice. Which, while it does lower the number of lower level spell slots that they can use, I would argue is far worse for the balance of the game, especially if you're not running as many encounters per day as the game expects you to, which is an issue I've brought up previously. I mean, just glancing at level 20 with this system, a level 20 wizard would now be able to cast 10 ninth level spell slots in a single day with this system, compared to being limited to only 1 per day normally with actual spell slots. Like, even just being able to cast a second ninth level spell in a day, let alone half a dozen, would make the game's balance even more laughable than it already is. So, the one good thing about spell slots that I can say is that it forces casters to sort of balance out their resources more evenly between higher and lower level spells. The designers are able to put hard limits on things, like making it so that even at 20th level, a wizard can only cast a single 8th and 9th level spell per day. But the flip side of this is that because of just these limitations in general, it seems that the designers have decided that they basically have carte blanche to just ruin the game's balance with those higher level spells. Here's what I mean. If you look at this chart that hopefully future me made during editing, I've essentially charted the expected power level of a magical and a martial class over the course of an adventuring day. As you can see, the idea seems to be that a magical class will naturally start out more powerful at the start of the day when they have all of their resources, and then as time goes on, they spend their spell slots throughout each encounter, and as they consume their resources, they will eventually run out and they would end up in a rather weak spot that would be below the power level of even the martial classes, who in turn stay at a relatively consistent power level as they either don't have any of these consumable resources or they otherwise recover their resources more quickly during short rests, but they also don't have any abilities that are nearly as powerful even when they are well rested. Now, it is obviously technically slightly more complicated than this. A caster doesn't typically spend their most powerful resources on the first fight of the day, but I think that this gets the general philosophy across well enough. However, I think that there are a few issues with this just in concept. First of all, as I've mentioned before in some of my videos, the system isn't very accommodating to different playstyles. A lot of tables run very short adventuring days, and if you're only playing a couple of encounters per day before you take a long rest, then you're effectively only going to be looking at the first part of the chart, where the casters are at their most powerful and end up being way stronger than everyone else. And in theory, if you play a game where you're like in a mega dungeon and you have like twice as many as the normal recommended number of encounters in a single day, then that would just mean that casters would end up stuck at the bottom of the chart for way longer than they're supposed to. So, like I said, the system really only works the way that it's intended if you play a game where you run the recommended number of encounters per day with no more and no less than that, which is why I often recommend that people play with the quote-unquote hardcore resting rules, where a long rest actually requires a full week of downtime, so that, that forces spellcasters to actually spend more of their resources. That way, if you're only running one or two fights per day, you actually end up with a closer encounter amount that resembles the way the game was designed. However, even if you are playing enough encounters to actually drain a spellcaster of all their spells, I have to ask, does this actually look balanced to you? Like, by its very nature, spellcasters are designed to be overpowered at some points during the day, and then underpowered at other times. To me, that doesn't quite work out. It's not like you're paying off a debt. It just means that the balance ends up being all over the place. Only being overpowered for some encounters still means that they're overpowered for those fights, even if they're forced to be underpowered in other fights later on. I just don't think it's a good way to balance your game, if you can even call it that. And just to touch on warlocks real quick, since I know someone will bring it up, in theory, I could see a version of the warlock that does a lot better than most of the traditional casting classes, because like a martial character, warlocks get their resources, their spell slots, back on a short rest instead of a long rest. But at the end of the day, it still ends up mostly playing out the same, because what few spell slots they do have are still of the same level that a full caster like a wizard would have access to, and past level 10, they just get access to much more traditional once per day spell slots, just like any other caster would for higher level spells. So it ultimately ends up playing out pretty much the same. Maybe if warlocks were like half casters or something with some more unique short rest abilities, it would be a different story, but I digress. So now the next question becomes, what can be done to remedy this? And there's a few things I can think of, ranging from minor balance tweaks to complete system reworks. For one, the slope of the line could obviously be reduced. If a spellcaster was only a little bit more powerful than everyone else for, parts of the day, instead of being insanely overpowered for those fights, it would at least feel a little better in terms of balance while still keeping most of the design philosophy intact. You probably want to raise the bottom of the slope as well, so they're only a little weaker than everyone else after using all their spells, but I honestly feel like we're already most of the way there with how things like cantrips and rituals work in 5e. This would mean doing things like nerfing high-level spells, or maybe even giving them drawbacks to casting them and things like that. I mean, hell, in my opinion, I've always just felt like spellcasters get higher-level spell slots way too quickly. Getting a spell like Fireball at only level 5 that is able to wipe out entire hordes of enemies in a single go, when martial classes are only getting a second attack, has always felt a bit rushed to me. I honestly feel like half-casters in general just have a much more reasonable spell slot progression when you compare their abilities to martial characters, holding off on things like third level spells and higher until at least mid levels, like around level 10. Now, to move on to another related idea, you could also just buff martial characters by a lot. But the problem with that is that in theory, all you really end up doing is making magical classes underpowered for more of the day. Like, yeah, don't get me wrong, martial classes should just be buffed in general, but if you buffed them to the point where they could keep up with what a wizard is doing at high levels, but without the resource costs, then you're just kind of shifting the problem into the other direction. And so that kind of brings us to the more grandiose changes that one could make. To follow the previous thought, if the issue is that bringing martials up to the same power level without the same resource limitations is bad, then we can just give them the same resources. And I mean, that does technically solve the problem. If martial characters had a system that was like spell slots, then the designers could give them similarly overpowered abilities that are also limited in their uses per day, just like those resources. And for those of you screaming in the comments, yes, I am effectively just describing the much maligned 4th edition of D&D. And yes, as many people are always quick to point out in these kinds of videos, 4th edition was the objectively most balanced version of D&D that ever existed. But a lot of people, including myself back in the day, really didn't like that. So why did that happen? Well, I think that 4E had a number of issues, but to keep things focused on class design and balance, I think that you lose out on a lot of the charm of the game by homogenizing all of the classes this way. Every class ends up being designed very rigidly, removing things like traditional multi-classing and whatnot, and operating on spell slot-like abilities. As a result, a common dig at the game that I remember from back in the day is that every class is now a sorcerer. You're playing a wizard? Actually, no, you're a sorcerer with a book. A fighter? You're actually just a sorcerer with a sword. You know, a cleric? Oh, you're a sorcerer with a holy symbol, you know, etc., etc. Like, yeah, this does solve the problem. The classes are objectively as balanced as they could possibly be, but you know, me and people like me are just not a fan of this particular solution. If you like 4E, then by all means, you can find the books and play it yourself, but in my opinion, I think that having different classes work off of different systems is kinda part of the fun. It makes everyone stand out and feel more unique, and lets you do wild things like multi-class to combine these normally disparate abilities. Having different classes work off of different systems just makes for a much wider design space to play around in. So, if we want to still keep spellcasters unique, but also balance them, then what can we do? Well, just because a spellcaster is operating off of their own style of mechanics doesn't mean that we need to use something like spell slots or a resource system like that to limit their abilities. There's actually a game that I really like that I think is a great example of this called Wrath and Glory. To catch everyone up to speed, Wrath and Glory is a 40k tabletop RPG where you can play as basically anything from guardsmen to Sisters of Battle to Space Marines to, yes, psychers with their own warpy magic nonsense, and I think that the way that this game handles its magic system is really interesting for this topic. So, like I was alluding to earlier, unlike games like D&D, there are no resources that directly limit a caster's ability to cast spells in this game. In theory, a psyker in this game could cast a spell every turn all day long without limits. Furthermore, there's very few limits on what spells you can take, so an early level psyker can grab some of the most powerful spells in the game fairly quickly. So how in the hell is any of this even remotely balanced? Well, for one, the spells don't get nearly as powerful and broken as they do in D&D. Looking at the Pyromancy discipline, for example, which is the most offensively oriented one, you can do things like shoot out beams of energy or create walls of fire, but the upper level of what you can do with it is a far cry from summoning meteors from space to attack an entire army. So it's a lot more reined in by comparison. They've reduced the slope, as I kind of mentioned earlier. Furthermore, casting a spell isn't actually a guarantee. One of the limiting factors that prevents lower level psychers from taking higher level spells is they have to actually make a check in order to cast a spell in combat. And if you fail that roll, you just waste your action and you don't get to cast your spell. You can still do other stuff on your turn if that happens, but you are specifically only ever able to try and cast one spell per turn, so if you fail that check, then you're just not casting spells that turn. And that adds a sort of risk-reward factor to the game that helps balance out what the more powerful spells are that do exist. Do you risk going for that big, bombastic, powerful spell and potentially waste your turn, or do you go for a more reasonable lower level spell that's easier to cast but won't make as big of an impact on the fight? But of course, there is also the mountainous elephant in the room for anybody who is actually familiar with the game, known as Perils of the Warp. No matter what, if you cast a spell in this game, you risk triggering Perils of the Warp. To avoid having to go into too much detail about it, think of it basically like every spellcaster in this game is a wild magic sorcerer, except that instead of it being a 1 in 20 chance of triggering wild magic, it's a 1 in 6 chance. And instead of most of the wild magic effects being pretty comical and silly, you have things like all creatures around you, including your allies, take damage and get staggered. You hallucinate bugs crawling under your skin, which not only deals damage to you, but also makes every check that you do harder for the rest of the fight. And even things like everyone in the area starts to suffocate as the air thins, and all future rolls to cast spells have an even higher chance of triggering more perils checks. And that's just the easy stuff. If you really mess up a roll, you can trigger far more dangerous things like summoning entire demons that immediately fight the party, or corrupting everyone around you and potentially causing them to gain permanent mutations that change their character for the rest of the game. Now, to be fair, this is obviously a fairly extreme example, thanks to this being a grimdark 40k game, but the practical takeaway from this is that they balance out magic without having to make it a consumable by giving it pretty explicit downsides and risks. As I said, a caster can technically cast as many spells as they want per day, but after hearing about all of that, would you want to risk it? It's a really interesting way of limiting a caster's abilities while still giving them powerful options that make them stand out from the more mundane party members. And this type of system essentially solves the core problems that I just brought up about D&D's balance. Now, instead of having some classes being explicitly designed to be overpowered for half the day, the magical and mundane characters are on a much more even footing. Hell, in some ways it feels a lot better to play a mundane character in this game so that you don't have to even worry about all that dangerous Perils of the Warp stuff. And since there's no resources or consumables tied to the magic system, the game naturally adapts to different playstyles. Tables that only run 1 or 2 encounters per rest should play just about as well as more hardcore games running a dozen encounters per rest. The main takeaway that I'm trying to get at from this is that you can absolutely design a magic system that is much more based around other limitations than just consumable resources. And I think that these kinds of systems tend to result in a much more evenly balanced and consistent experience than what D&D offers with its spell slot based system. And of course, there are lots of ways that you could do this. The dangerous Perils of the Warp stuff from Wrath and Glory is only one of numerous ways that you could balance out magic. To quickly go over another example, another game that I've been super into as of late is called Lancer. Lancer is a mecha style RPG where each player gets their own cool customized giant robot to pilot and punch things with. It's a load of fun, and honestly I should probably make a whole video just talking about how cool this game is. That said, it is a lot more sci-fi, so it doesn't have an explicit quote-unquote magic system per se, but I mean ultimately what we're really talking about isn't magic systems specifically, we're talking about any kind of additional system that is layered on top of a more traditional combat system. So in Lancer's case, that would be things like hacking and using NHPs and other paracausal technology, as opposed to just using normal swords and guns and such to attack your enemies. And yeah, as you can expect from the subject of this video, most of these systems have drawbacks that are not based around consumable resources. Now, admittedly, some of the systems that you can equip do have the limited trait, which essentially means that they do function like spell slots and can only be used like X number of times per day, but that is a minority of specific systems, and even then, there are talents that you can take in the game, like Grease Monkey, that lets you replenish or even increase the number of uses for those limited systems. Otherwise, the vast majority of these systems lack these kinds of hard limitations, relying more on softer limits like the game's heat system, where activating certain more powerful abilities can cause your mech to heat up, and if it gets too hot, then you risk overheating and may suffer penalties, or even cause your mech to melt down if you don't spend a turn stabilizing yourself. So the downside of these more powerful systems is having to manage extra mechanics like your heat meter, and possibly having to spend a turn or two cooling off throughout the fight, while more simple mechs that don't use these systems that cost heat don't have to worry about it as much and thus have more uptime. So yeah, like I said, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds as there's a lot of cool stuff in this game, but I think that's just a small slice that demonstrates what I'm talking about with how you can balance these more powerful systems in interesting ways without necessarily imposing a daily limit on them. A player can still use a lot of these powerful heat generating systems all day long, but they need to either pay for it by spending turns cooling off, spending extra system points to equip things to help them deal with the heat, or by just letting themselves overheat and taking whatever debuffs come their way. It's kind of interesting because you sort of get to customize what your downside is depending on your build. But yeah, that's enough of talking about other systems. I think I've gotten my point across pretty well that there are plenty of alternative ideas that, in my opinion, are much better designed to have significantly better balance between more traditional martial characters and more specialized magical characters. These systems no longer have this issue of having some members of the party being way too powerful for parts of the adventuring day, and also adapt pretty well to different playstyles with differing numbers of encounters per day. And I think that these two problems are arguably two of the biggest design issues with D&D itself. Ultimately, I'll fully admit that this critique is a bit late for D&D. It's not like I'm expecting them to completely redo the entire magic system entirely in the couple of months up to the release of the new core rulebooks later this year, but hey, maybe Wizards can take notes for when they want to make a 6th edition of D&D in a few years or so. And of course, you, as a player, can maybe look into some of these sorts of systems in any other games that you play. After all, I did just recommend 2 great alternatives to D&D if you want to try something new with your table. And as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. I'm curious if you guys know of other systems that you've played with interesting magic systems, like the ones that I've brought up, where there is some other downside to casting spells than them just being consumable. And hey, maybe if you want to make your own tabletop RPG from scratch, you can use these kinds of systems as a reference for some other ways of designing your mechanics. Hell, I've had a few ideas in my head for a while for a tabletop magic system that I've just sort of been spooling around for a bit. So if you want to see me make a video about that, then maybe you should make sure to let me know by giving me a like and a subscribe and saying so in the comments. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.